Welcome to South2North from our studio at Wits University in Johannesburg. The pressure today to perform on the sports field, to become the champion, to win for yourself and for your country impacts dramatically on sportsmen and women everywhere. Tennis champion Yana Novotná, playing the Wimbledon final, 1 point away from winning, millions watching, about to be crowned the champion. Instead, she throws the game away. She chokes. Lance Armstrong, a national global icon, says he was driven to doping to remain a champion on the world stage. Recently, the poor performance of the Australian Olympic team was partly blamed on the usage of prescription drugs like sleeping tablets. And our very own talented sprinter, Oscar Pistorius, is facing murder charges. Could the pressure of fame and the public gaze have led to the violent act? Is the pressure to succeed in today's sporting world just too much? How do athletes under this kind of pressure not choke, not dope, and most importantly, remain motivated? What is to be done? To help us with this problem, we have some champions in this room. Today, we talk to a former basketball star and international NBA scout, Amadou Fall. The NBA is the world's premier basketball league, and he's their point man in Africa. Joining him is leading sports scientist Dr. Ross Tucker, whose focus is on human performance and physiology and elite sports management. And to start with, we have Deshaun Desal, who climbed 13 of the world's highest mountains. Welcome, Deshaun. Is it 13 or has there been more since I last wrote that?
It's actually 14 expeditions, but of course some of them I've returned to, and so it's 14 expeditions and not 14 mountains.
Including Everest, of course. How many times did you do Everest?
I've been to Mount Everest on 2 expeditions now, and I'm hoping to see another 1 or 2 in the future.
But the first attempt is interesting. It's the one that the world was speaking about for many, many years. 1996, when 12 members died. That was the most historic and the most frightening. What happened?
In fact, that was the key sort of shift in mountaineering, especially in climbing on Everest. Not because people are now climbing for their country anymore, but because people wanted to climb for the glory of being able to say they had done Everest. And you don't have to be a professional sports person to be able to do that. And the second thing is more and more inexperienced people started to climb Everest because that is the expedition that highlighted to people that if you have sufficient cash, you can pay someone to lead you up the mountain. And it was, of course, the big reason why there was such a major disaster on the mountain.
Mm-hmm. People died. What did that do to you, to your mind, as someone who wanted to get to the top?
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that happens when you're taking on a high-risk goal, like trying to climb Mount Everest, is it's a bit like a fireman. You know, he knows he's going to have to face a fire at some point in his life, and that there is the prospect of losing his life, and so do all his teammates. And so it's the same with Everest. You go in understanding that there's a very, very big risk of you or one of your teammates dying. So you kind of live with that understanding the entire time. Of course, you try to avoid it, but the real truth is that you've got to learn to understand that dying is a possibility, and also then coping with someone else's death is just as much of a possibility.
That's really frightening. I mean, I run ultra marathons. I've done about 11, including 4 comrades marathons. And every time I have to go and assure my grandmother in Soweto that I'm not going to die, that I'll be back. Yet, in spite of that, you went back. Why did you do that?
Well, the first time I climbed Mount Everest, I was very young on the team. I had a lot to learn, and I started to climb very late in the climbing season, so I didn't get a chance to go to the higher camps on the mountain. And as a result, I ended up in Camp 2, which was the highest I could climb under those circumstances. And I knew that I could push my body a little bit further. So I signed up to be on a second Everest expedition in 2003.
But when you turned back, would you call that choking?
In 1996, I wouldn't call that choking because it really was the limit that one could reach in the climbing season, and it would have been very, very silly for me to try and push my body any further. Your body really needs to acclimatize to lower and lower levels of oxygen, and it takes as long as it takes. So if you try to fast forward that process, then obviously you're asking for a massive disaster.
Mm-hmm. But about choking, is that an inevitable part of extreme sport?
I think choking is performance anxiety, really at its basic level. And I remember when I went back to Everest in 2003 on my second expedition, my limit was, of course, 6,500 meters, Camp 2, which is where I'd been, and that's the highest I'd been. But I wanted to see how much further I can push my body. So my next camp, it's not the highest camp on the mountain, but for me, my next best would have been Camp 3. And I promise you, there were moments while I was climbing to Camp 3 when I was convinced that I'm not going to make it. Our team doctor at that stage, who was sitting in base camp, was saying, no, of course you can keep climbing. You've only got about 500 vertical meters more to go, but that would have taken me 3 more hours to climb. And I was convinced that I'm getting in such a bad state, I needed to return back to Camp 2. But because he kept saying, you can do it, there's nothing wrong with you, just take an antibiotic or something, I actually made it to Camp 3.
Let's talk about the relationship between choking and doping, where athletes dope because they're afraid of choking. They're doping, of course, to enhance their performance, but also there's that fear of not achieving what is expected of them.
As with an antidepressant, if you're feeling anxious, you can take something to make you feel better. And perhaps it's the same principle when it comes to choking and doping, is you know that choking is a moment of anxiety. And in order to relieve the anxiety, you've got to perhaps give yourself an enhancer to not let your mind go there. And if your mind doesn't go there, your body can keep going. But then, of course, there's the other dynamic of doping to get the physical extra that's going to allow your muscles to twitch faster, to carry more, that sort of thing. Yeah.
But with mountaineering, I understand that there is some medication that's allowed, for example, supplemental oxygen or some steroids to help you with mountain sickness. Are you for that?
There is a drug called Dimox in the mountains, in high altitude climbing, that allows your body to acclimatize quicker to the altitudes. But of course, the danger of that is if you're on a mountain like Everest, which takes almost 3 months to climb, and you keep taking Dimox, then you're reversing the process of acclimatization because your body is not supposed to, 1, be up there, and 2, have that kind of drug in its system. So people probably have better performance on shorter mountains, a week-long expedition, maybe 1.5 weeks. But if you're on a 3-4 day expedition, Dimox should work for you. I don't advocate it. I still think the body should do its natural thing to acclimatize. But then Dex is the steroid that you can take, and really it shouldn't ever be taken unless you're at the verge of dying and you still have the presence of mind to inject it into you, because it gives you a quick rush of adrenaline that allows you to just quickly think about the next move to do and getting to a camp safely.
So that's mountaineering. We're going to find out a bit more about basketball. Can a person dominate the global stage without performance enhancers? Let's bring in the NBA's man in Africa, Amadou Fall. Welcome, Amadou. Have a seat, please. Welcome. It's lovely to have you here. How does a young man from Senegal, Africa, move so far that he plays for, it's the Mavericks that you played for?
Actually, I worked for the Mavericks for 12 years, played in university.
And not only that, but you graduated magna cum laude in a US university. Tell us about your journey.
I met a gentleman from the Peace Corps who facilitated me obtaining a basketball scholarship at the University of the District of Columbia, where I played and majored in biology, and graduated and had an opportunity through sport to meet some great people. I've been to great places, and it really opened my eyes to the power of sports as a tool.
You also say that if you had had the opportunities earlier, you would have gone far in your basketball career. And yes, when I think about where I come from in the township of Soweto, soccer was the sport because it was inexpensive. The boys and girls just played out in the streets. Talk to me about a lack of facilities on the African continent and how that impacts on your career trajectory.
Certainly. I wasn't exposed to the game until much later. I was already 16, 17 years old because obviously you need some basic infrastructure to play the game. That's one of the reasons why I'm so driven to make sure that our game is accessible to young people across Africa at a much earlier age. It drives really everything that we do because we see that there's tremendous interest and passion amongst young people for the sport of basketball. It's the #2 sport globally. We have over 30 players from Africa who played in the NBA over the last 20 years. And this is even before we came in and started the grassroots efforts that we're doing. I think that speaks volume to the talent, that's here on the continent. And we're determined to make sure that We give access to kids who want to play the game and help them achieve the highest level.
Surely basketball is not just about the physical, there's the mental preparation as well. Talk to me about that.
It's just, maybe managing their own careers, relationship, because you are a 22-year-old or 18-year-old, or in some cases, fresh out of college, all of a sudden you're a millionaire. When we teach the game in our grassroots program, we make sure that there's a life skills seminar that goes across it. So players are exposed at a very early age that, yes, shoot for the moon, try to win, but at the same time, there are rules to abide by.
But at the end of the day, they also want to win. How do you make sure that you don't make the entire team choke?
It's a team game, so you trust your teammates. If you're not having a good day, there are so many ways you could contribute to your team winning. And it's not just about scoring the basket or grabbing the most
It was about the points.
Yeah, but you can do other things. You could make the pass that led to the basket that win the game. You could grab the rebound that, end the game on a winning note. So I think understanding the notions of teamwork, making sure that, leaderships are really explained to children. What does it really mean? So it doesn't mean that definitely you don't want to cheat.
So it's not possible for the entire team to choke. When somebody's having a bad day, the rest of the team is there.
Somebody else will pick him up. And at the end of the day, you accept that the best team is going to win the game. And, this is...
But for people like Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, LeBron, Steve Nash, who was born in South Africa, incidentally, is it possible for them to dominate the world stage without taking performance enhancers? Is it just about the body and the mind?
They have. All the guys you just mentioned, they've dominated our sport. Obviously,
without any
Michael
assistance.
Jordan, the greatest that ever played. Steve Nash, who I've worked with in Dallas for 7 years. I mean, great players, two-time MVP. Magic, obviously, resume speaks for itself. These guys have done it. They've done it in broad daylight, and they remain inspirations for young players, young basketball players across the globe.
Well, then now is a good time to bring in Dr. Ross Tucker, our sports scientist. Welcome, Ross. Have a seat, please. Thank you very much for joining us.
Sure.
Now, I know that your PhD research, which was supervised by Professor Tim Noakes, who was our guest here, and in your research, you looked at the role of the brain in endurance performance. Tell me about that.
Yeah, we looked at how the brain regulates pacing and performance so that you don't exercise yourself quite literally to the point of death. And what that means is that when you exercise, there's always a safety margin or a reserve beyond which you can't go. And so it's interesting because when you hear someone who's a high-altitude mountaineer, they're talking about that point where you're at 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 meters, and your body is clever enough to know exactly what it has available, how much oxygen there is, what sort of state it's in. And it's constantly feeding that back to you and saying, look, you've got a little bit left. And at some point, it says you're done. Now, it's at that point that mental strength starts to take over, because what you want to do is eat into that reserve as much as you can. You can't completely do that, because then you could quite literally exercise yourself to death. And we know that doesn't happen except in very rare circumstances. And so the whole concept was that your exercise performance is regulated by the brain with a reserve in order to protect you and optimize performance at the same time, because those are conflicting demands.
Where does the theory of choking come in? It sounds to me that choking is a good thing then, because that's when the body can no longer go anymore.
Well, that would be an underperforming probably more than it is choking. Because if I could very simply define choking is thinking too much, as opposed to panic, which is not thinking. So either one can cause underperformance. Because a team, for instance, could just panic. There's no leadership on the field or on the court. Everyone starts making foolish decisions. Things go pear-shaped. As opposed to choking, where someone starts to overthink, overanalyze. You spoke about the tennis player, Jana Novotná, where suddenly things that she's done for 20 years automatically, without thinking about, become mechanical tasks. She can't hit a ball anymore. It's innate, but she's overthought it, and it becomes impossible for her to do.
Where does doping fit into this? How does it muddy the waters? Because if you're taking performance enhancers to help your body through, that means then you are silencing the natural phenomenon.
It does, and it acts in two places. One is in the body, changes the signals coming back. It gives more oxygen carrying capacity and so forth. But also in the brain. And the most famous example of that is a cyclist in the 1960s riding the Tour de France by the name of Simpson. It was an extremely hot day, and they were climbing a mountain. And one of the dangers physiologically when you're exercising in the heat is that your muscles are producing so much heat that your body temperature can get to dangerously high levels. Normally, your body says you're done because you've almost overheated, that's that reserve. But he was taking a drug called an amphetamine, and the result of that is that you just keep going and going and going. There's no off switch. The bad example is that's why people take ecstasy when they go clubbing, is because it allows you literally to just go and go and go and go.
You're a machine, literally.
Yeah, and he literally exercised himself to the point where he should have stopped and beyond, and ultimately collapsed near the summit of that climb and died. Amphetamines aren't used as widely anymore now, but that's an example of how drugs can affect the normal regulation of exercise and why they are so dangerous.
Does society place too much pressure on sportsmen and women? Is that why they do that?
It probably is, and certainly what we've learned in the last 5 or 6 months coming out of cycling and the whole Armstrong affair is that a lot of young guys went into the sport with good intentions and found themselves in a position where they felt, rightly or wrongly, that they had no alternative but to dope. And there's that disillusionment that came across from many of them saying, I came here to be a great cyclist and to test myself, and suddenly now I'm using drugs. This is the last thing I wanted. That's not an excuse, though, because for every guy who doped, there was one who said, no, I'm not doing this. Sure. Unfortunately, probably more like 10 who doped, one who didn't.
So their playing fields are not level.
Right, and so those were the heroes in this story. It's not the guys who are now telling the truth. It's the guys who walked away and said, I'm not willing to compromise my health and my principles in order to keep up with a system that I actually don't agree with.
Amadou, you're going all over Africa trying to find talent, and I know that you are unearthing this amazing talent. What do you say to young people who want to be the next LeBron James? How much pressure are they going through, and how should they handle it?
If you're well-grounded, you understand that, okay, you have a plan B, and this is what we really preach all the time. We want them to really, work as hard as they can to achieve that goal if that's what they want, which is playing in the NBA. But at the same time, we want to make sure that if they don't make it in the NBA, they can become doctors through their education.
Is competition a bad thing?
Yeah.
You
not
put
at
too
all.
much value on it?
No, we push competition because I think life in itself is about competition. You compete sometime, against yourself. Where do you put the bar? What are you trying to achieve?
And I suppose mountaineering is exactly that. I mean, I would never win a marathon in my life, but I am competing against myself. I want to cut off 5 minutes from the previous time, 10 minutes, 30 minutes. What is that for you, the personal competition?
It's very dangerous to think of climbing as a competitive sport because your risk of dying in climbing is much, much, much higher than any other competitive sport in the world. And so it should probably not even be called a sport. But I think when people start to think, I want to better someone else's record, then you're moving into dangerous territory, which is partly why 1996 was such a big disaster. We had 2 competing commercial climbing guides who have both summited Everest multiple times, but they wanted to prove to each other they can get other people to do the same. And of course, a lot of leadership decisions then fell by the wayside because their value system, as Amadou put it, was in the wrong place. And that really guides every choice you then make. And often those choices turn into disaster.
But Ross, that's just for us. You've worked with some of the most famous athletes. What motivates them? Surely for them, there's a lot at stake. The public gaze is always on them. What are their anxieties and how do you keep them grounded?
There's no doubt that in competitive sport, the outcome matters. And it's a really difficult place to be in. It's a lonely place when you're losing, and it's an unrealistic, ungrounded place when you're winning. And I think the management of people in that environment is key. The problem is, when you do what, for example, Amadou's doing, or what cycling does, is it finds these young guys who, without the sport, probably have far less opportunity or scope and potential in their lives. And you tell them, work hard, dedicate yourself, be committed, be disciplined, and you can succeed. And then when they get there, you say, and please take 2 of these in the morning, because that's the drug you'll need, for example. Or if you cheat, you can get even further ahead and so forth. But there's no fallback plan. And that's what you spoke about, is that then you put a young child or a young person in a situation where they can't see the alternative. And that's the problem. And so that's why life skills is becoming more and more important, is to try and mitigate against that single-minded focus on I must win.
But at the same time, Amadou, I'm going to ask this to you. I understand that single-minded focus. When a sports star, and I've spoken to many soccer players who saw soccer as a way out of poverty. You said that you didn't play for the NBA, but you got something else in return, in education. But for that child in a village somewhere in Africa who's talented, they want to make it because it's not just about showing their talent, but it is about escaping poverty. What would you say to someone like that?
This is why when we talk to them about having the right values, understanding teamwork, leadership, and living a healthy lifestyle, and always feeling a sense of responsibility to your communities where you come from. I'm sure you're very proud of, going back to Soweto, making sure you try to impact other young ladies, to follow in your footsteps.
The bigger picture.
Exactly. It has to be beyond sport. It has to be bigger than just, the athletic talent that you have. You got to trust that the same drive you have to succeed on the court, you could apply it to something else and still succeed and come back. Mm-hmm. So, that's really what I think.
And the irony, sorry, just to add to that, is if you want sustained success, you have to have that anyway. Exactly. Because if your target is only to win, then what do you do when you get there? Exactly. And that's why so often in sport, you see people succeed and then they disappear, and they succeed and they disappear.
Well, you see it in the mountains too. When people set the goal to just reach the top of the mountain, so many people have died because they just run out of energy because their goal is achieved now. Right. So they die on the way down because there isn't sufficient mental or physical energy or motivation to take them down the mountain safely.
And that's why you kept going back and back.
Well,
you have that
well, there's that, but there's also the understanding of what am I going to do, as Amadou says, with the opportunities. I can categorically state I'm not the fastest, strongest, fittest, anything type of mountaineer, and the opportunity that's come out of mountains is now putting me in a position where I can empower other people with the knowledge and experience I've gained in the mountains.
But do you wanted to come in there?
All successful people fundamentally they're the same factors. They are motivated, self-motivated, they are disciplined, and they work hard. These are the values that we make sure that young people understand. We make sure that they have the same approach when they're trying to learn to play our game.
Mm-hmm. And they understand the bigger meaning of what they're doing. That's key. Because I always look at the great athletes we're lucky enough to see, Phelps, Federer, Nadal. These guys have won everything. Why do they come back? Mm-hmm. Why would you, having won 8 gold medals in one Olympic Games,
9.
Why would you do 5 hours of training a day for the next 4 years and give up the prime of your life to win gold medals? It's got to be more than that. It has to be for those individuals. There must be a realization of something bigger than just what happens on the scoreboard or how many split seconds you win a race by or winning the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th medal. There has to be something bigger.
Much bigger.
And that's, I think, the key.
Sadly, the world is talking about our Paralympian, Oscar Pistorius, and of course it's too early to prejudge the case. It's with the courts and they will decide whether he's guilty of murder or not. What goes on with the emotional, I think, intelligence of a young person or a person like Oscar who becomes successful at a very, very young age? That must come at a cost.
It must do, but I would be careful about the knee-jerk reaction of saying, look what sport does, it creates these monsters who can't, because for everyone who's gone that way, there are thousands who haven't. There are thousands of people who haven't disillusioned or, in this case, it's potentially committing a very serious crime, or it could be doping and so forth. And I think, again, it probably comes down to the unit that person has developed with, the family unit, the friends, the coaches, the people who influence them in their lives. But I would be cautious about saying that whatever has happened there is the consequence of the fame. And I'm sure that it could contribute, but I also don't think that the link is as straightforward.
Because there are many more sports stars who are not in the same situation.
Right, and there are sports stars who've achieved more. I mean, when we talk NBA, we're talking about multi-million-dollar contracts straight out of school. Mm-hmm. And fame, which we see an athlete, a track and field athlete, we think that's big. In the United States, these guys are under 10 times more pressure, and they haven't gone in the same way. They haven't ended up in that same place. And so I would be cautious about saying that there's a link there. I think you just get some individuals who things happen to.
No, exactly. And I think, as you referred to people like some of our icons, Magic Johnson earlier, these people retired from playing and now are very successful business people. Their success on the court can translate into any other endeavor that they decide to undertake in life. They have to have interests beyond just their own individual self-interest, mm-hmm. which is maybe giving back to the communities where they are from, because that's how you make, I guess, the ball go around.
Yes, absolutely. And that's how you build communities. And there's no doubt that many nations have benefited from the developmental role of sports. Thank you very much for chatting to us. What a fascinating discussion. Thanks indeed.
Thanks for having me.
You can tweet your questions, comments, and opinions to @AJ South2North or find us on Facebook. See you next week. Bye-bye.